Avrà ora luogo l'incontro FolleMente con Patrick McGrath.
Thank you very much. Thank you, volunteers. That was great. What a very good festival. I'm very honored to be here. This is an essay called Writing Madness for Cagliari, 2015. I've come to the conclusion recently that the fiction I've been writing for the last 25 years or so has been all about madness. So what I'd like to do tonight is talk about what pushed me in this direction, and also about the work of other writers who took madness as their subject and who influenced my own work. So this is a talk called Writing Madness. A psychiatrist introduced me to ideas of madness when I was 8 years old. He was my father. For 25 years, he was medical superintendent of Broadmoor Hospital, a top-security mental hospital near London, once called Broadmoor Lunatic Asylum. I've never suffered from schizophrenia, but as a young man, as a young boy, I should say, I learned much about that illness from him. I say illness. Schizophrenia is now thought to be a cluster of related symptoms rather than a single unified pathology. A syndrome, not an illness. It was once believed to involve a split personality. But my father explained to me that the schizophrenic was more properly regarded as having a shattered personality. It may have been that conversation and the dramatic image of the shattered personality that set me on course for writing madness. My early reading was largely horror fiction. I devoured the stories of Algernon Blackwood, M.R. James and Sheridan Le Fanu, and later Ambrose Bierce and Edgar Allan Poe, who aroused in me an enduring taste for Gothic literature. I later came to the conclusion that with Edgar Allan Poe, a pivotal moment in the history of Gothic fiction occurred, when a genre that had been identified largely with supernatural phenomena turned toward psychological dysfunction and discovered in the disintegrating mind a vein of black gold. For with Poe, it became the special talent and function of Gothic fiction to expose the workings of the unconscious mind, a world of nightmares and phantoms, of sublimation, regression and displacement, of doppelgangers and other monsters of the id. It was extensively mapped for more than a century before Freud organized the material in a theoretical format and wrote madness from within a scientific paradigm. Psychoanalytic theory and the case studies underpinning it are the continuation, by other means, of the Gothic novel. What is a Gothic novel? I co-edited a fiction anthology that came out in 1991 called The New Gothic. It contained stories by writers who seemed to me to be working in the Gothic vein, with Gothic themes, if not with Gothic furniture, by which I mean thunderstorms and ruins and clanking chains and the rest. We included writers like Jamaica Kincaid and Joyce Carol Oates, Peter Straub and Martin Amis, William Vollmann and Lynn Tillman, all of whom, as I say, employed Gothic themes in their work. These themes I identified as transgression and decay. I suggested that if transgression and decay were foregrounded in the work, it counted as new Gothic. Later, I came to realize that a third term had to be introduced into this black trinity, and this was madness. Intuitively, we glimpse the relation between transgression and decay and madness. And I was interested to read recently the English painter Julian Bell say of an exhibition in Paris called The Angel of the Odd, dark romanticism from Goya to Max Ernst, that the central fear around which dark romanticism revolves, which is neither that of death or of evil, nor the supernatural, is rather that of madness. The fear that the subject is incoherent, that I is ungovernably other. Enlightenment reason was inherently inclined to tug away at its own underpinnings, push the theme of reason hard enough, and you end up digging at reason's roots in the psyche, and beneath it in the organism and in existence per se. I associate Edgar Allan Poe most strongly with this turn towards madness in our literature. In his tales of horror, Poe gave us a fine collection of neurotics, paranoids, and psychopaths. And in particular, I think of the demented narrators of The Telltale Heart and The Black Cat, and also of Roderick Usher and William Wilson. But I don't believe any one of Poe's characters is quite as chillingly mad as Montresor, who narrates The Cask of Amontillado. Montresor's account of his soured friendship with a man called Fortunato opens in the first line of the story with a threat. The 1,000 injuries of Fortunato I had borne as I best could, but when he ventured upon insult, I vowed revenge. What a wealth of pathology is revealed in those words, for it soon becomes clear that the 1,000 injuries Montresor mentions are less harmful to him than the insult he claims to have suffered. What are they then, these 1,000 injuries? Are they slights? Innuendos, perhaps, hints and whispers. As the tale unfolds, with growing unease, we begin to understand that it's on account of these slights and the insult that follows that Montresor has bricked up his friend in the vaults of a crumbling Venetian palazzo and left him there to die. This is writing madness of a very high order. It's also a good early example of the unreliable narrator at work, for having drawn us into Montresor's paranoia with his very first sentence. Poe will not let us escape. Like poor Fortunato, we too are walled up in a suffocating structure from which only death, or the end of the story, can release us. Until that moment, we are imprisoned in a logic that is entirely sound, but for the fact that it's erected on a false, mad premise. My own first serious attempt to practice the black art of writing madness properly came with a novel that bore some faint echoes of Poe. It was intended to be the simple tale of a London plumber who murders his wife so that he can move his mistress, a prostitute, into his house. I hit on the idea that the plumber's little boy should narrate the novel. I then decided that the boy would remember these events as an adult, but that what he recalls is not what happened. It then dawned on me that my narrator was not merely unreliable. He was psychotic. He suffered from schizophrenia. This is when the problem of writing madness first announced itself to me loud and clear. Fictional narrative and psychotic illness would seem to be mutually exclusive entities. My plumber's son didn't possess the chilling intellectual rigor of Poe's Montresor, but he was no less insane. A disorganized creature whose thoughts jumped and drifted at the whim of the world around him. And this apparently random association it sparked in his untidy brain. Nicknamed Spider by his mother. Before her untimely death, his unmedicated mind was an incoherent construct of irrationality, hallucination, and bodily delusion. The novel, however, as I then understood the form, it was my second, demands a kind of swelling narrative progress grounded in causality that ultimately offers a clear design. The task became to render the wildly fluctuating chaos of psychosis within the ordered frame of the narrative, without either misrepresenting the illness or obscuring the clear movement of the story. Now, closely imagined accounts of madness in literature are more rare than you might think outside of Poe, as I discovered when I began to look for precedents. What instances there were of writing madness, at least in the 19th century, tended to be Gothic. Wieland is an outstandingly bleak early American novel involving murder followed by suicide. Written by Charles Brockton Brown, it was published in 1798 and narrated not by the madman himself, but by his sister. It depicts a pathology all too familiar to us today: voices instructing a confused man to make a fatal strike against his own family. While Wieland had some bearing on Spider's tale, more useful for my purpose was a short story written almost a century later, Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper. The author was a feminist, a philosopher, a socialist, and an activist, and she was inspired to write the story after undergoing what in late 19th century America was called the rest cure. This was a treatment prescribed for women diagnosed as hysterical. And it was invented by a man called Silas Weir Mitchell, a distinguished Philadelphia neurologist. By her own account, Charlotte Perkins Gilman became so desperate, deprived for 3 months of books, of work, and other forms of stimulation, that she saved her sanity only by resuming her writing. Her story was intended to convince Silas Weir Mitchell of the error of his ways. It's narrated by a woman whose physician husband won't let her leave her bedroom, where it's intended that she recover from her temporary nervous depression, a slight hysterical tendency. And she starts to go mad. Of particular interest to me was the precision with which Gilman's narrator depicts the stages of her own breakdown. She's unaware throughout that what she's describing is a rapid descent into psychosis, one that involves a bizarre cluster of delusions, narrowly focused on the yellow wallpaper in the bedroom that has become her prison. Without question, there's method in her madness, and each stage of the descent follows with an inexorable logic from what came before. And as with Poe's Montresor, it all makes sense, but for the initial mad premise. So I imagined my own character, Spider, descending into madness also by stages and under the controlling influence of a flawed assumption. I imagined him returning to the East London neighbourhood where he'd grown up, a threadbare, mumbling man who, in his lonely wanderings, finds his eyes drawn irresistibly to the looming circular structure of a gasworks, a not uncommon sight in that part of the city, and it fills him with horror. I also imagined that many years earlier, his mother had come home late from the pub and then passed out in the kitchen and died from gas inhalation. The reader won't learn of this for some time, however. One night, as Spider sits in his shabby room at the top of a local boarding house, he detects an unpleasant odor. He realizes it's coming from himself, and it smells like gas. He tears open his clothing, and yes, there can be no doubt about it. Gas. My reader will understand that for this disturbed and fragile man, gas has an awful significance. But why? That night, Spider takes his sheets of yellowing newspaper that line the clothes drawers in his room, and he ties them around his torso with sticking plaster and string. When he's bound in newspaper from neck to groin, he puts his clothes on, all of his clothes, the better to suppress the appalling smell. Later, he will come to believe that he stinks of gas because he's going bad inside. His organs are shriveling and rotting, starting to disappear. And so it goes on. By this point, I hope my reader is seeing Spider not as a monster of unreason, not even a mere sorry instance of common abject lunacy. No, I want the reader to be decoding Spider's torment, understanding that the belief that one stinks of gas must be connected to a profound conviction of one's own badness, one's guilt. It sounds like very crazy stuff, and so it is. But no psychiatrist who's treated schizophrenia will be surprised by these florid, somatic delusions. While researching schizophrenia for this book, I came upon a phrase in R.D. Laing's The Divided Self, perhaps the best account of schizophrenia ever written, that provided the key to understanding the character I was trying to bring to life on the page. The schizophrenic, said Laing, is dying of thirst in a world of wet. I saw a man living in a London neighbourhood, but so isolated, so profoundly separate, that he's unable to make a human connection and no love, or even friendship, or even the simple warmth to be had from common daily interaction with others. He's dying of thirst in a world of wet. And for a writer of madness like myself, this was a priceless insight. The novel of madness in the 20th century is often characterized by a kind of naturalism that's absent in the more stylized Gothic or Romantic fiction of the earlier period. It marks a shift away from the Gothic, although it tends to follow Charlotte Perkins Gilman in her focus on the disturbed woman at the mercy of a man, whether a doctor or a husband or just men in general. 3 outstanding novels of madness, all written within a 10-year period from 1961 to 1971, and all by women, explore the themes of madness in often excruciating detail. In The Bell Jar, Sylvia Plath's novel of mental breakdown, a young woman becomes alienated from all that is familiar to her and drifts rather than plunges into madness, growing increasingly isolated and subject to bizarrely skewed perceptions. At one point, she glimpses in her friend's mouth an evil spirit, a dybbuk, that has invaded her body and speaks through her. Later, the young woman attempts suicide and is hospitalized. I felt as if I were sitting in the window of an enormous department store, she writes. The figures around me weren't people, but shop dummies, painted to resemble people and propped up in attitudes counterfeiting life. She continues to think constantly about suicide. Will she slit her wrists, she wonders. Will she drown in the sea? She undergoes her first bout of electric shock therapy. Quote, and with each flash, a great jolt drubbed me, till I thought my bones would break and the sap fly out of me like a split plant. The horror of insanity and of the methods used to treat it is rendered all the more vivid for being described with such sharp clinical lucidity. In the end, it's the simple image of the bell jar that most perfectly expresses the hellish experience this suffocating woman is going through. Wherever I sat, I would be sitting under the same glass bell jar, stewing in my own sour air. Sylvia Plath's story was mirrored with cruel precision in the facts of her own brief life. When the book came out in England, where she was then living, she was in a bad way. Her marriage to the poet Ted Hughes had collapsed. She had no money. She was living in a bare flat with her 2 small children during the coldest winter in 100 years. And all 3 were sick with the flu. The bell jar again descended, as she always feared it would, and she sank into a profound depression. She killed herself by means of gas on February 11th, 1963. She was 30 years old. A contemporary of Sylvia Plath's was the New Zealand writer Janet Frame, whose novel Faces in the Water gives an even more terrifying picture of a psychiatric incarceration and electric shock therapy. The novel takes place entirely in a woman's mental institution, and of all the horrors of the place, the narrator finds herself, quote, dreading more and more the sound of the trolley and the stifled screams as it moved from room to room, nearer and nearer. And suddenly, the brightness of Ward 7 seemed to burst into a glare of chaotic vegetation, as if it existed now merely to camouflage the movements of deadly reptiles and poisonous insects, end quote. The trolley contains the equipment required for the administration of electric shock therapy. But then comes an extraordinary variation on the theme. Jean Rhys was a writer whose work was widely read in the 1930s, but who'd so completely disappeared from sight that she was thought by many to have died. But she had one last book in her, Wide Sargasso Sea. And in it, she takes Charlotte Bronte's great Gothic novel, Jane Eyre, and tells the story not of Jane Eyre, but of Mr. Rochester's mad wife, Bertha, who's locked in an attic of his great house. Jean Rhys imagines Bertha's early life when she lived in Jamaica as Antoinette Cosway, a Creole heiress, torn from that life and carried off by a man she has come to hate. To a cold and distant land she goes mad, and in her madness destroys her husband's house. Charlotte Bronte's novel is thus turned on its head, and as our attention shifts from Jane's tribulations to an understanding of the mad woman imprisoned in the attic, of what she has suffered and why she burns down the great house, destroying herself in the process. I hadn't read Wide Sargasso Sea when I wrote my own novel of a persecuted woman some 25 years after Jean Rhys. It's called Asylum, Follia in Italy. And curiously, my father inspired the novel, and not merely by enabling me to grow up on the grounds of a large psychiatric hospital. I'd been casting around for an idea for a while, and I remembered an incident from my childhood, something unresolved, a story without a proper ending and lacking in any real depth of detail, remarkable not for what had happened, but for what had not. I remember I entered a room where adults were talking, and at once they fell silent. Whatever was going on was not for my ears. But nothing will more reliably provoke a child's curiosity than being told, in effect, that there is a secret, and that he's not to be let in on it. This occurred in the medical superintendent's house, a large red brick Victorian villa which stood 100 yards from the main gate of Broadmoor, and as I say, my father was the superintendent. The secret was this. An illicit relationship had been discovered between a doctor's wife and a patient. Broadmoor doctors were forensic psychiatrists, and the patients, many of them criminals, who'd been found not guilty by reason of insanity. I believe the patient in question lost his parole privileges as a result of the incident, meaning he was confined within the walls of the hospital and could no longer work on the grounds. Later, the doctor's wife left the hospital with her husband and family, one of whom was a boy my own age and a particular friend of mine. This fragile and certainly flawed scrap of narrative was all I had, but it gave me the germ of Asylum. I would set it in 1959 when it happened. It was a time I remembered as clearly as I remember anything of my childhood. I had not yet been sent away to a boarding school, and the long summers in the fields and forest around the hospital were the best of times in this small boy's secure and untroubled life so far. I knew the look of Broadmoor as it then was, the feel of the place and its people, and I was confident I could bring it to life on the page. Now I had my story. It would be about the wife, I gave her a name, Stella Raphael. She came alive. I could see her at once, an attractive, sophisticated woman. She missed her life in London and was bored, not only with the members and wives of the senior staff common room, but also with her husband. He's called Max Raphael. Stella and Max have a child, Charlie, aged 10, and him I knew very well indeed, for he was me. His parents were not mine, but in his fascination with toads and watery places and football and the parole patients who came out every day to look after the grounds of the estate and whom he treated as benign uncles, this was me, a plump, toothy, precocious child. He was in love with his mother, but eager for conversation with his father about all manner of things. I was soon plotting his downfall. But first, Stella Raphael. It was then about 10 minutes before feminism properly arrived in the south of England. In the late 50s, the opportunities for a wife and mother in a rural hospital community were not plentiful. I wanted her to have few outlets and an unfulfilling marriage, also a ripe disdain for the social possibilities on offer. Only the deputy superintendent amuses Stella. He is Peter Cleave, a worldly, cultivated older man, unmarried, and committed to his own private pleasures. One of Peter Cleave's patients is Edgar Stark, a sculptor who works in the Raphael's garden. I remember the ease with which the early part of the story was written. It's very rare. I counted it as a good sign in retrospect, although at the time it made me uneasy. Stella at once recognizes in Edgar Stark a kindred spirit, like herself, incarcerated unjustly in this place of rigid constraint and numbing routine. The sexual affair begins. It is a thing of recklessness and passion. The lovers form an unholy alliance, and it was clear to me what must happen next. With Stella's help, Edgar escapes from the asylum and flees to London. It was at around this time in the writing of the book that serendipity occurred. On a visit home, browsing through my father's bookshelves, I found a slim volume about a rare psychiatric disorder. It was called Morbid Jealousy and Murder. I devoured it at once. And by pure chance, that book gave me all I needed, both to establish Edgar Stark's pathology and to suggest the gravity of the danger Stella faced. This man was violent, and it was against women that his violence had been directed in the past. I saw all this, and I saw redemption. I saw a scene on Southwark Bridge, the lovers reunited, and their future, although far from easy, assured. For did they not know love? In the early stages of a book, a novelist may imagine 100 endings to his story, but rarely does any one of them survive. Lovers on Southwark Bridge, a smoky sunset, this was all a wishful dream. For where can they go? By leaving her family and joining Edgar Stark, Stella has put herself not only beyond the bounds of her marriage and her community, but also beyond the law. But there is nothing beyond the law. There is nowhere to go. Edgar, of course, had long been beyond the law. Edgar had murdered. Now they were in hiding. It was surely only a matter of time. A major decision would soon have to be taken. I was writing the novel first person, from Stella's point of view. I continued to do so, eager to discover, by means of intense imaginative identification, all I could about this bold heart. But I became aware that I must soon take the story away from her. The novel couldn't allow her full dominion over the meaning of her experience. To Stella, the world was well lost for love. But that world contained a child, and I needed another voice, a dissident voice, telling her she was wrong, that the world was not well lost for love, that we bear responsibilities to others, and that we transgress at our mortal peril. I'd realized whose voice it had to be. Everything I had assiduously uncovered within Stella's mind and soul would have to be put at the disposal of this man, and the reader would have to take sides. It was Peter Cleave, the psychiatrist. I'd hatched a careful plan in regard to my research for Asylum. I had, of course, my own memories of Broadmoor, and in addition there were mysterious movements of serendipity. But my intention had always been this. I would rough out the book in first story and get the story down on paper. I would then go into deep conference with my father. I looked forward to another richly pleasurable collaboration with the master. But I'd left it too late. My father was ill. He wasn't strong enough to give me the benefit of his vast experience in the ways of asylums. Late one autumn morning in my wife's house in London, I finished the first draft of the book and then drove down to Berkshire. I missed him by an hour. 10 days later, I returned to London and resumed work on the novel that I would now have to finish by myself. The work went quickly. Peter Cleave proved a most suitable narrator for Stella's story. He had access to her account of the affair and a psychiatric understanding of the man Edgar Stark. His view of what Stella regarded as a love for which the world was worth losing was more prosaic than hers. He saw not love, but something else, a kind of madness. It took me a long time to get the ending right. I remember being with my father once at dusk, crossing a yard inside Broadmoor. I was 8 or 9 years old. A scream came from a high window in Block 6. Even now, the words Block 6 put a chill up my spine. It was where the most disturbed male patients were housed. New admissions went into Block 6 if they presented any risk. Men who had in most cases committed grievous acts of violence while psychotic. But it wasn't a scream of wild fury I heard that evening. It was a scream of the most wretched misery. I looked up at my father. "Poor John," he said, and I understood that he understood what his patient was suffering. This is what writing madness must try to express, I believe, empathy and compassion for the existential limits to which men and women can be driven by mental illness. I think it was the psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan who described the speech of schizophrenics as language without discourse. This is a useful formulation, but for the novelist it's not enough. A discourse, a coherent story, must be discernible within even the wildest ramblings of an insane narrator like Poe's Montresor or Jean Rhys's Bertha Rochester. Technically, it's a highly demanding form of fiction to write, but it's not without rules and structure. Madness is never arbitrary, never random in its manifestations or its causes. The reader who's been successfully enlisted as a kind of psychiatric detective will find herself engaged in novels like these with minds as rich in complexity as any in our literature. That such minds operate largely blind to their own dysfunction only compounds their terrifying unpredictability. Thank you. Thank you very much. Oh, thank you.
Adesso Patrick McGrath risponderà alle vostre domande. Aspettiamo che l'interprete Milena Finazzi venga a coordinare la cosa. 2 secondi che arriva. Non farti male, Milena. Su.
Yeah. Are we all right? Are we okay? Okay.
Caldo.
I know, caldo.
Caldo. Vai. Milena Finazzi.
Hi, John.
Hello.
So here we are.
Here we are for any questions that may come.
Let's see. That's been intimidating.
Is it?
No.
Was it too fast?
No.
No?
It was very.
It was okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Qualcuno ha delle domande? Perché sennò noi andiamo avanti a chiacchierare. Io non vedo.
Here, Miss. Okay. Good evening, Mr. McGrath.
Good evening.
Welcome. Okay. So it is commonly believed that to write about believable characters or to write about something, you have to experience that something in some way. Like you talked about Sylvia Plath and the bell jar. And she was suicidal in real life, and then she wrote about suicidal characters. So, do you think that to really write about madness, there must be at least a spark of madness in the writer, or you can access to that knowledge in some other way? Thank you.
Would you like to translate that?
Sì, la domanda è sostanzialmente questa. Uno scrittore scrive delle cose che sa. Sylvia Plath, prima di suicidarsi, ha scritto spesso del suicidio. Quindi la domanda è, serve avere un pizzico di follia per raccontare la follia?
Okay. It's can I come around here and talk in here? Yes. Yeah. It's a very good question. It's quite a difficult question. Yes. No, I haven't finished yet. Yes, the writer needs the experience, but the writer also works with an imagination. So I only need, a little splinter of the experience. I can have just a hint of it. When I was a teenager, I was very unhappy. I was a teenager, and I suffered greatly. Later, when I tried to imagine madness, I took my experience as a teenager and exaggerated it, and said that my isolation, my difficulty with the world, my anger, my failure to understand the world, if that was not just a teenager's normal experience, but instead an overwhelming experience that crippled me, then I might know madness. And that's how we work. We take a splinter and we make it into a forest.
Allora, è una domanda difficile. In realtà serve l'esperienza, sì, ne serve un po', ma serve anche l'immaginazione. Giusto una piccola parte di esperienza. Quello che io faccio normalmente, quello che facevo all'inizio, è immaginarmi ragazzino, adolescente. Scrivendo della follia sono partito proprio dalla mia adolescenza, dall'isolamento, dalla difficoltà di comunicare col mondo e dalla rabbia, dall'incapacità di entrare in contatto con gli altri. Ecco, io ho preso questo disagio che provavo da adolescente e l'ho dilatato enormemente, e questo disagio dilatato mi ha aiutato a raccontare la follia. Altre domande?
Hello. Mine is, so to say, a very practical question. Can one get in any way the text of the essay?
Text of?
Sì.
He wants to know if he can get the text of the essay. Yes. Does the festival have a website?
Ma penso che si possa, se passa in segreteria da noi, credo si possa organizzare, sì, la nostra segreteria. You don't mind if it's distributed?
Not at all. No.
Allora, Patrick dice che non ci sono problemi per lui, quindi a questo punto non credo ce ne siano neanche per la segreteria a distribuirlo. If you want to go and visit us, maybe you can have a copy.
Thank you.
Did you say that it would be available on the website?
No, it's where the group is working.
Oh,
every
okay.
day, yeah, but I guess they can put it on the website.
Okay, we'll talk about
anyway,
that. Yeah.
Lo potrete avere tramite internet se vi interessa. Sarà disponibile il saggio di Patrick. Direttore, ce lo conferma che sarà pubblicato sul sito? Perché per Patrick non ci sono problemi. Per noi ce ne sono? Benissimo. It will be available on our website. Ok? Grazie.
Okay.
Buonasera.
Buonasera.
Salve, vorrei sapere cos'è per lei la follia d'amore.
It's the madness that comes from love for you. Love madness. Define it.
The love madness. I think the love madness comes when the love is so fierce, so intense, that the lover loses all contact with responsibility, with social duty, with care about work or family or child even, where all that matters, all that consumes the lover is the hunger for the other, and nothing else is of any importance whatsoever. And you see the lover in this condition and you say, this person is mad. But it's a glorious madness. And it doesn't last very long, but while it's there, it burns like a fire, and it is mad.
Allora, dicasi follia d'amore. È la follia che si verifica in una persona quando l'amore è così violento, così forte, così intenso, che la persona che ne è, diciamo, colpita perde ogni senso della realtà, trascura il lavoro, la famiglia, tutti i suoi doveri sociali. E l'unica sensazione che prova per certo è una fame disperata per l'oggetto del suo amore. E quando noi vediamo una persona che è innamorata così, vediamo subito che è matta, ma è una follia gloriosa e meravigliosa e generalmente dura poco, però sì, è una follia.
Yes.
Buonasera, io vorrei sapere, scusate non parlo inglese, vorrei sapere nel suo modo di raccontare le storie, sembra davvero che le persone danzino una danza d'amore con la follia e che però quel filo che avvolge le anime ferite poi alla fine conduca inevitabilmente a una sorta di tragedia o di involuzione. C'è una via d'uscita dalla follia? E secondo lei la follia nasce dalla società o è semplicemente una parte della società?
The madness of love.
Yeah, no, madness in general.
Oh, madness in general. Madness in general.
Ma
Yeah.
parliamo sempre della
Madness.
follia d'amore o della follia in generale? Madness, pure
Oh.
madness.
This is another difficult question. I think I would take the position that there is some physiological basis in madness. There are chemical imbalances. There are neurophysiological problems, dysfunctions. But having said that, these problems will be either exaggerated by social conditions or diminished. Somebody who is suffering from mental illness will, I think, be far less badly damaged if they are within a loving family who understands what is going wrong, whereas somebody born in poverty, let's say, in an unsympathetic world, will probably experience their own mental illness in a far more devastating manner. So there is probably an interaction between the mind and society in the development of any mental illness.
Dunque probabilmente c'è una parte proprio fisica, organica nella follia, ossia degli squilibri chimici, dei problemi neurologici che sono, diciamo, alla base della malattia. Certo è che c'è anche uno sviluppo diverso della malattia, un progredire diverso a seconda delle condizioni sociali in cui la persona che soffre di questo disagio psichico si trova, perché se una persona ha la fortuna di nascere in una famiglia amorevole e viene curato e si trova in un ambiente favorevole, certamente la sua malattia progredirà in modo diverso rispetto a quello che può succedere a una persona che invece vive in condizioni di povertà o di mancanza di empatia e di solidarietà. Quindi la malattia mentale sicuramente ha una relazione con le condizioni sociali, c'è un'interazione tra la mente e la società.
I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm
Non
guessing.
sono uno psichiatra però,
No. No.
Almost.
Almost. No, I didn't think so.
Grazie. Innanzitutto complimenti per la bellissima serata, per la sua lezione. Volevo sapere che rapporto ha lei con i film tratti dai suoi libri e quanta follia ha visto in questi film, soprattutto nel film di Cronenberg.
No film is perfect in the eyes of the writer of the book on which it's based. But when I saw Cronenberg's film of Spider, I thought, this is my story in another medium. I saw a work of art that was fine and deep and beautiful in its depiction of the horror of Spider's experience. And so that was a very happy experience to see this film being made of the book. I felt that he did it justice. And this is rare, but Spider was great.
Nessun film è perfetto agli occhi di uno scrittore, perché comunque si tratta di una trasposizione del suo lavoro, ma per quanto riguarda Spider, che è stato girato da Cronenberg, io devo dire che la mia storia è stata raccontata in maniera magistrale, è stato un lavoro sofisticato, attento, molto bello, e il regista ha descritto perfettamente l'orrore della storia e quindi ha reso giustizia al mio libro, e questo è molto raro.
Yeah. There is an idea that the anthropologist Levi Strauss said during his study of the myths of the various peoples he worked with. He said, every version of the myth is the myth. And I sometimes think that works for books and films, that each is an expression of the myth, and that in some way they are equal.
C'è un'idea che ho ripreso dall'antropologo, da Levi Strauss, il quale ha detto che ogni versione del mito è il mito. Ecco, penso che questa affermazione sia valida anche per la resa cinematografica di un libro. Narra la stessa storia.
Yep.
Hello, thank you for the evening, first of all. I would like to talk about another glorious madness with a negative sign before it. I'm talking about suicide bombers and terrorists. Is it not a sort of collective madness? What's your opinion about it?
Do I understand you rightly as saying suicide attacks, terrorist attacks, are a form of collective madness? Am I correct? Is that the question?
Collective. I mean, not whole Pakistan, whole Afghanistan is terrorists, but I mean, a group of many persons tend to go in this direction.
Yeah.
And I'm at loss to understand the phenomenon.
I feel this, yes. I would say that the men who killed the people in the Charlie Hebdo office were lunatics. I thought that was madness, a terrible, terrible madness of violence and hatred, that it was impossible to see any rationality, any decency, anything civilized in that action. I think it would be very clear to me that that is a sort of insanity.
Se pensiamo a quello che è successo alla redazione di Charlie Hebdo, non vedo come definire altrimenti questo comportamento. È follia pura, pazzia, odio. Ha ragione, scusatemi, la domanda era il terrorismo nella sua forma di attacco suicida. È una forma di follia? E la risposta di Patrick è sì, che quello che è successo a Charlie Hebdo in realtà è follia allo stato puro, è pazzia, è violenza, è odio, perché in questi atti non c'è nessuna forma di razionalità, non c'è nessuna forma di civiltà ed è chiaramente atti del genere non sono altro che espressione di follia pura. Nessun'altra domanda? Sì, forse ce n'è una.
No? Okay.
È tutto? No, ce n'è un'altra ancora.
Oh, there's a lady there.
Grazie. Innanzitutto la ringrazio perché il suo discorso era bellissimo e l'ho apprezzato tantissimo. Faccio la domanda volutamente in italiano perché la capiscano una volta prima tutti quanti i sardi. Vorrei chiederle se parlare di follia è per caso un'anticamera di una sua intenzione al parlare di morte, visto che ha parlato di causalità e il trovare connessioni causali è per uno scrittore, ma per un vivente in genere, una modalità di vivere, quella che sembra mancare alla follia. Così come non si può raccontare e vivere la morte, non si può raccontare e vivere la follia. Cosa ne pensa?
It's difficult to describe.
Well, I think you can talk about madness and you can talk about death. I don't understand the problem.
Può riformulare la sua domanda perché in effetti era un po' complessa. Abbiamo avuto delle difficoltà a decodificarla. Scusi, sarà allora.
Non è il fatto di parlare di morte o di parlare di follia. Possiamo parlare di tutto, ma così come è difficile vivere la morte per qualsiasi mortale, è difficile vivere la follia per qualsiasi normale. Quindi le parole della follia, di chi racconta la follia, così come le parole del vivente che racconta la morte, sono un po' come dice Lacan, il discorso impossibile, è la perdita di senso. Quindi la difficoltà dello scrittore è quella di trovare parole con senso e legami causali, ma nel modo in cui lo fa già una scelta, come la sua scelta poco fa di rispondere alla domanda sul terrorismo come pura follia. Se c'è legame fra follia e morte, può darsi che sia una scappatoia. Perché lei dovrebbe essere più sensibile al depresso e meno sensibile al fanatico? È una modalità di vita, potrò non accettarla, ma è una modalità di una scelta.
No, I am more lenient towards the mad than I am to the terrorist. Yes, I am. I am. The terrorist is not suffering from an illness. He is promulgating evil, I think.
Sì, in realtà è così. Io sono più tollerante nei confronti di chi ha una malattia mentale, perché è una persona malata. Non sono assolutamente tollerante nei confronti di chi è un terrorista e propaga la violenza. Questa è la verità, sì, è una scelta.
I don't know. Well, okay. I think
Abbiamo finito.
Is that it? Okay. Thank you, Milena.
Thank you, Patrick.